represents a further 20% of the syllabus. Now, as with the economics sections earlier on, I said to you there was no objective to turn you into an economist. Well, similarly here, there is no objective for you to become an IT specialist. Instead, what the examiner is going to expect from you is for you to demonstrate your understanding of IT and its impact on an organisation, specifically how it can be used to competitive advantage. Now, being 20% of the syllabus, chapters 3 and 4 between them would be expected to cover 20% of the final exam, as a result of which we do see this material coming up regularly. Specifically, a classic question is to identify the value of information and information systems for organisations. So we could see a scenario given where an organisation is perhaps not operating at full potential, and you might be asked how your understanding of information systems could help this organisation to move forward. Now, before we start talking about information systems, we need to make sure that we understand what information itself is. So we'll start by defining that, and then we'll move on to IS and IT. Now, these two terms, IS, information systems, and IT, information technology, are often used interchangeably. However, that's not inevitably the case. The simple way of separating these out is IS, information systems, asks what is it that needs to be done. So what needs to be delivered, what information systems do we have? IT asks how do we deliver this? Now, in the modern business environment, we're seeing a number of emerging trends with information systems, unsurprisingly, very fast-moving environment. So we'll cover some of those, specifically in here, the virtual organisation. The idea that it's possible to operate commercially without being in a physically close location to your colleagues. And finally, we'll look at privacy and security. The idea that this information is of value to an organisation and therefore it needs to be protected both for legal and competitive reasons. Section 1. Introduction to information. The main message at this point is that we are not limiting ourselves to accounting information. We're talking about any information that an organisation can use, analyse, process, and otherwise benefit from. So as a result of which, this information can be used for a whole range of factors, most obviously improving operations. How can we do the same thing but better? How can we save costs? How can we improve communication? The benefits of communication, of course, is an increased efficiency, an increase in motivation of staff. And ultimately, how can I make a good decision? With most commercial decisions, they shouldn't be based on gut reactions, on personal subjective opinions. They should be based on hard information. Information that can be measured and quantified. So, for example, how big is my market? That can be objectively quantified. Now, for information to be of value, it must be accurate. Now, this is a great mnemonic and one that will come up a number of times through not just your study, but also your working life. So, is the information accurate? Is it factually correct? So if I get a bank statement in that says I withdrew £50 when in fact I withdrew £30, that information is not accurate. But accurate in itself isn't enough. We also need to make sure the information is complete. So with my bank statement still, it's no good having a factually correct statement that I withdrew £30 from my bank account if it fails to mention that there was also a direct debit that took £500 out of my bank account. Is the information comparable? We want it in a similar format so that we can compare one period against another. Now, this is where, with your accounting information, it becomes very obvious. We want to be able to see a comparable profit figure, for example. Is it understandable? One of the most common criticisms of accountants is that we mask our skills with this sort of veil of complexity and terminology that makes it incomprehensible. So information needs to be understandable. It needs to be relevant to the user. If you think back to your emails, how many emails do you get that are simply not relevant to you and just get deleted? Well, that is not good information. It must be agreed in the sense that it is unbiased, that it is not reflecting just one perspective. It is agreed between a range of people involved in generating this information. It must be timely. It's no good knowing the lottery numbers if you don't know them until after. Finally, effective. We must make sure that this information is effective, that it can actually be used to some benefit. There might be all sorts of information that's very interesting, very entertaining, sheds all sorts of light on human nature, but is actually not going to help me to run my business. Now, information is created through the processing of raw data, and I'm going to differentiate here between raw data and information. As the name suggests, raw data is unprocessed. It is in a raw form and therefore is not in its ultimately usable form. We need to analyze it in some way, shape or form in order to get meaningful information. Lecture example 1 is designed to get you thinking about how wide the implications of information are. So the requirement says, when you're at work, where do you get information from? Consider internal and external sources, as well as formal and informal ones. Can I suggest that you might want to draw up a bit of a grid here and head it up: formal, informal, internal and external. And I'd like you to just spend a few minutes generating some ideas on here. Remember, I'd like you to make it as relevant to your real job as possible. In other words, don't give the answer that you think the examiner wants to hear. Give the real answer, the real sources of information. Please press pause now, and when you have completed that, when you've got at least one item for each of these quadrants, then please press play and I'll give you some ideas. Right, well, traditionally the examiner says students are very good at generating formal sources of information. So let's make a start with these. Formal internal information. You could have agendas for meetings. You could have the minutes that come after the meetings. You might have written procedures and manuals. All of those are objective, formal, internal sources of information. If you're looking for formal external information, you could be looking here at technical journals or other media, most obviously things like newspapers. You could extend this to government websites. So, for example, if you want to find out about your tax obligations, you could visit the HMRC website. If you want to find out about grants and other things, there'll be other government websites. Those are formal sources of information. Now, one of the things the examiner says is that students don't often think about informal information, and yet this is very important. It still needs to be considered here. So, for informal internal information, I'm going to refer to the water cooler. Now, you might not want to write the water cooler in your exam, but we're talking here about this informal chatting with your colleagues. Now, okay, a fair proportion of that might be on what was on TV last night, who's doing what at the weekend, but it's also probably going to have some aspect of work involvement. What are you doing at the moment? Oh, I'm working on this really difficult project. Well, actually, it's funny you should say that because I'm working on this. Maybe we could help each other. Didn't you know that so-and-so is doing something similar? All of those sorts of informal communications. You could extend this to something a little bit more formal. On-the-job guidance. So this is when you're actually working at your desk. You're not using a procedures manual, but you're turning around to your colleague and saying, "Look, could you tell me how to do this, please?" And your colleague leans over, presses the button, tells you what needs to be done. Informal external information. Well, this is when we are talking to friends, family, and other outside contacts. Sometimes you might bump into somebody and you start chatting to them, you find out that you have a shared interest, or perhaps you work in similar areas, and you end up chatting away and saying, actually, if you need any help, give me a ring type thing. Certainly as a lecturer, I'm always meeting all sorts of different people in a variety of informal contexts, and as soon as I find out that they're in an industry that might have some relevance to my paper, I'll start quizzing them and tell me about your job, tell me about what you're doing, and I'll incorporate that into a lecture example or an anecdote that I get in the classroom. Section 2, Information Systems. Now in this section we're going to look at all the different types of system that you can get at different levels in your organisation. Now I should warn you that some students sometimes shy away from the technical detail here, learning these different systems. The examiner does know that and therefore makes a particular point of testing them. So please make sure that you have learnt these different types of system and that you can give a practical example as to how they could be used in the modern business environment. Well, the first thing we're going to do is break down our systems into 3 different levels: strategic, tactical and operational, because the needs of information will change and therefore the needs of information systems will have to change at each of these levels. At a strategic level, we're looking at high-level, long-term, subjective decisions, mainly using external information. This is your board of directors, so senior people within the organisation. You step down a level to your tactical level. These are your middle managers. These are the people who are making sort of medium-term decisions, so perhaps over the next year, 2, 3 years, sort of plans, projects and things like that. They will report back into the directors, into the board of directors, who are going to be making sure that they're on track for the 5-10-year plan. We then step down to the operational level. This tends to be more of the sort of the supervisor's role, the day-to-day low-level decisions. So we could think about perhaps a supervisor within a store or within a factory who is deciding how many people are allowed to go on holiday on one day, how many people can take a tea break at once, how many members of staff do I need for tomorrow, for next week, those sorts of short-term decisions. Now, to look at these systems, we're going to start at the bottom of the pyramid by looking at operational level systems. And we refer first of all to TPS, the Transaction Processing System. And this system is simply designed to capture and store very large volumes of data. So the example you've got here is EFTPOS. EFTPOS stands for Electronic Funds Transfer at the point of sale. So 2 dimensions to this. The first is electronic funds transfer, the second is point of sale. It's a very posh way of saying it's the checkouts in your supermarket. Those tills do 2 things. The first thing they do is they record each item sold. So by scanning the barcode, they know how many pints of milk, how many loaves of bread, how many tins of beans have been sold. The second thing that they do is they allow the electronic processing of payment. So that's the EFT part of that. But if you imagine, for example, Tesco's will have huge volumes of data on this transaction processing system. The problem with this data is that there's such a huge volume of it that it's almost impossible to understand without further processing. So what we do is we move on to a management information system that's going to allow us to process this raw data into meaningful information. And the idea here is that you'll be able to produce reports for middle managers. So perhaps the store manager at Tesco's might look at how many barbecues have we sold this week. You know, is it perhaps a particularly sunny or rainy time of the year? We could be looking at, what are the latest trends, perhaps, what sort of wines, what sort of beers are people buying at the moment, to make sure that that can be catered for. Now, there's no way that you could look down the list of every single item sold and see that unless it's processed into a summarized form. The second thing that one of these middle managers might use is a decision support system. It allows you to see what might happen if one of your input factors change. Now, the most obvious example of this is the use of Excel in a spreadsheet. If you use Excel properly and you use formulas, perhaps you could be doing a cash flow forecast. And what you could do is change one of those figures, and if the formulas work properly, the implications of that change should flow through the whole spreadsheet. So maybe if my sales are down, what's that going to do to my overdraft position? If my sales go up, what's going to happen? That is a classic decision support system. The third thing that a middle manager might use is an expert system. Now, an expert system allows a non-specialist to generate a complex, normally technically complex, output. I dare say that almost all of you listening to this are not actuaries. You're not qualified actuaries who analyse statistics. And yet, each of you is able to work out your own insurance premium. And you do that by going online, typing in all of your data into what you see as a website, but what we would refer to as an expert system, and based on your postcode, the value of your car, your age, etc., you would get an output, you would get an insurance premium for that. So that is a classic expert system. Now, as we move up through the organisation, we get to strategic systems, the executive information system. Now, if you think about this from the board of directors' point of view, the board of directors will be interested in internal data, how much has been sold here, there and everywhere, but they're also going to be particularly interested in what's going on outside the organisation. In other words, this management information system that the tactical manager uses is not going to be enough for them. So what you would tend to see with an executive information system, sometimes referred to as a dashboard, it's a user-friendly system, almost always computer-based, that summarizes key data. So maybe it might show a very simple graph of total sales for the business. And what the director can do is click on that and zoom in on either specific locations or specific brand ranges in order to find out more. But the key with an EIS is that it is also linked to external information. What are my competitors doing at the moment? What are the general trends in the market as a whole? How do we compare to that? Section 3, Information Technology. As I said at the start of this section, information technology asks, how are we going to deliver what people need? Now, there are a couple of specific areas that the examiner wants you to know about, specifically CAD and CAM, computer-aided design and computer-aided manufacturing. We've seen dramatic developments in these in the last 20 years or so. It's a continually improving area. Computer-aided design means that IT is used in order to design products. So for example, if you want to build a new car, you're not going to be going out there with a welding torch and cutting up bits of metal. What you're actually going to do is you're going to design it on a computer first, and you can test aerodynamics and weight and efficiency and all sorts of other things without actually building anything physical. That's computer-aided design. Having designed your car, you can then enter into computer-aided manufacturing. This is when the physical product is created through the use of technology. And again, staying with the car analogy, the most obvious example here is the robotic production line that manufactures your car for you. Now, away from the production line, you've got the electronic data interchange, or EDI. This facilitates the sharing of information across any system. I'm going to put a reference in here to section 4.3, Enterprise Resource Planning. Section 4. Emerging Trends in IS. Now, when we talk about recent developments in IS and IT, we're talking about the last 10 years. So you don't need to panic about being tested on technology that's just been launched in the last 3 months. This is very much a big picture, long-term analysis here. But the sorts of emerging trends that we've seen fall into 3 categories. Enterprise-wide systems. The idea that information can be shared much more effectively. Knowledge management systems, how having shared this information can it be effectively controlled and communicated. And finally, customer relationship management. How can we develop a relationship with the customer? We're going to look at each of these 3 in more detail. So an enterprise-wide system is ultimately a network. Now, we've got some references here to local area networks, LANs, or wide area networks, WANs. For the purposes of this exam, you need to just be aware that data can be very easily communicated across a network. Obviously the World Wide Web is a huge network, but most organizations will have their own internal networks of printers and servers and all sorts of other things. ERP, or Enterprise Resource Planning, is a software system that is designed to integrate a number of different software packages. Now, in the old days, you used to have a payroll system, and you'd have a completely independent finance system, and a completely independent operations system, and another completely independent purchasing system. Well, with ERP, one system can do all of that. So examples here include SAP and Oracle. These are systems where you buy a framework, and into that framework you slot in all of these various modules, your payroll, your finance, your time recording system. And the great thing about it is that they are all linked up together. I remember the days when you used to have to print out the output of one system in order to manually key it into another system. That wasn't so many years ago. Obviously with ERP, you don't need to worry about that anymore. And finally in this section, you need to be aware of databases. Of course, a database is simply a pool of data that has been put into one place, and that is then accessed through a database management system. So perhaps we could draw this up. All the data gets thrown into a pool, and it's thrown in unprocessed, raw. You've got this huge volume of data there. For us to get meaningful information out, we use a database management system. And the great thing about this setup is you can have these management systems accessing the same pool of data for completely different purposes. So that's your database system. Lecture example 2. Now this is an exam standard question for about 3 marks. Databases enable multiple users to access the same data at one time. They reduce storage costs and increase data integrity by only keeping one master set of data. That is a very useful summary then of the advantages of databases. However, this question asks, what are the potential disadvantages of using a database? Now, I dare say that you will have some form of database that you use at work. You may even have some that you're using for sort of domestic purposes, accessing and storing information. So I'd like you to press pause and just briefly generate the sorts of problems, the sorts of disadvantages there might be of using this database system as opposed to your own freestanding system. So please press pause now. Right, well, the potential disadvantages then. Well, the disadvantage links into the advantages because we allow access to multiple users. The disadvantage of that is there is the risk of a breach of security, the risk of unauthorized access, the risk of unauthorized alteration or deletion of data. So we need to make sure that this data is protected. That's one of the problems with the database. The other problem is we're celebrating the fact that all of our stuff is being done by one single system. Well, that's all well and good, but what happens if that fails? Whereas we might have had a number of freestanding systems, now if it's all on one system, if that data goes or is corrupted or is lost, we're in big trouble. For a database to work, it must be maintained. Large databases should have a database administrator. The question is, who is that going to be? What are their responsibilities? All too often organisations set up a database, they don't appoint an administrator, and then they then get surprised when all this data is being thrown in and nobody quite knows what's going on and what's accurate anymore. Linked into that, therefore, is the cost. The cost of setting up a database and the cost of maintaining it. Well, just to finish off then, we've got 2 more emerging trends in IS that you need to be aware of: knowledge management systems and customer relationship management. A knowledge management system then is designed to store, organise and disseminate knowledge. This is most commonly used for professions. So for example, if you are an accountant, if you are a doctor or a lawyer, you'll be expected to keep abreast of technical developments in your specialist field. Now, that's not always easy to do because things are always changing, so what many of these organisations have is a knowledge management system that is designed to store all of the relevant data in an easily accessible format. So sometimes if you go to a GP, for example, you might see the GP typing into the computer some of the symptoms to see if there's any new information or guidance on it. They're obviously not using Google, or at least they're hopefully not using Google. They should be using a more technically advanced system that will be specialising in all of the medical reports that are published. And finally, customer relationship management. This is a really practical experience of how information system can generate competitive advantage. And I'm thinking here specifically about Amazon. Amazon records, obviously, all of its data, its transactions, if you think back to our information systems examples, using EFT POS, an electronic point of sale that records all the transactions. But that data in itself isn't hugely helpful. I suppose they can analyze it for management purposes, who's buying what. The great thing that technology now allows Amazon to do is to say, David, you just bought film X. Have you thought about buying book Y? Because lots of people who bought film X also bought book Y. So that is a very effective way of generating extra sales through customer relationship management. This is developed also now into what we call Web 2.0. That is a syllabus term you need to be aware of. It's the latest generation of internet communication, which involves a much more complex interaction between users. Facebook and Twitter are obvious examples of this. Your trivia for Facebook: did you know that Facebook has 400 million registered users worldwide? It's a mind-blowing number of people. And even more frightening, 200 million of those people access Facebook daily. Now that is a huge number of people. The power, therefore, that is registered, that is within that organization, the information power, is absolutely mind-blowing. Lecture example 3 asks you to consider which websites you visit most regularly and why you visit them. Now, you might think this is a bit of a game to just keep you entertained, but what I'd like you to do is, first of all, just think about the websites that you visit. Why do you visit them? What is it about them that attracts you to them? Having done that, I'd then like you to take a step back and ask, how does that information give competitive advantage? In other words, what is it that you as a consumer are looking for in that website? Why do you choose that website and not another one? Because if you can answer that question, then you can give that competitive advantage to an organization. Now, within the exam, obviously the examiner is not going to say to you, tell me what your favorite websites are. But it's quite conceivable the examiner could ask, what makes a website successful? What factors need to be considered? So that's what we're really going to focus on here. So I'd like you to press pause, have a think about the websites you visit, perhaps even go and visit them and have a look at them and ask, what is it about them that attracts you in a way that the competitors of that website don't? Right, well, you'll have your own list of websites, but just in case you've had a complete mental block, popular websites, we've already talked about Facebook. We could talk about the BBC website. We've talked about Amazon and sites such as eBay. So what is it about these sites that attract us in a way the competitors don't? Well, key things include easy navigation. Can I get where I want to quickly? Useful or reliable content. If I read an article on the BBC website, I should be able to rely on it reasonably, in a way that if I'm reading some sort of gossip site is probably a little bit more dubious in content. Linked into that, the reliability technically. Hopefully this website won't be crashing on me every 10 minutes in a way that perhaps some other websites might be. And linked in specifically to eBay, the volume of users, the other people who I can get in touch with on this website. One of the reasons that eBay is so successful is the huge volume of users. If you put something for sale, chances are there's somebody out there who's interested in buying it. Section 5, the virtual organization. We've established then how information systems enable us to process and analyze and understand information in a way previously not thought possible. Well, the virtual organisation is the next logical step from that, because if you can communicate that effectively, why do you need to be in the same physical location as a work colleague? And of course the answer to that is you don't in many cases. Now this extends not just to working from home, but also working with perhaps another office in another part of the world. One project I was involved in, the project team was split between the United Kingdom and India. And using technology we were able to work together as a single team in a way that wouldn't previously have been possible without the technology. So, lecture example 4 takes your practical common sense and fine-tunes it into an exam scenario. I'm a great believer that the more that you can see the real life application of this, the more that you're going to do well in the exam. The examiner does expect you to have good, strong technical knowledge, so you won't get through this exam by bluffing it on common sense. However, what the common sense will give you is a practical context and application that will really impress the examiner. So, I'm going to ask you to think whether you, given a free choice, would choose to work from home. And what would be the implications of that decision for your employer? Some positive and some negative. So, I'd like you to press pause now and just spend a minute or two generating some positive and negative factors that will influence your employer's decision as to whether or not to let you work from home. Well, positive implications for your employer. There's no need to run the office with all of the overheads and rates and rent and furniture and space, etc. that is required. Working from home can often motivate staff. You can attract a better calibre of person, in theory, by offering this flexibility that perhaps other competitors might not offer. As a result of which, it should be easier to recruit staff. We can access a pool of labour we wouldn't otherwise be able to access. What is the disadvantage? Well, the biggest disadvantage is the perceived loss of productivity. If you're working from home, there is nobody to supervise you. If you are an undisciplined person, that means you are not going to be working at your most productive. We're going to see some theories of management later on in this course where this type of management gets debated at more length. But there is a risk of staff just sitting around at home doing nothing. And the more you work from home, the more your team spirit is undermined. When you actually work in the same physical location as somebody else, you interact with them on a social way. Remember those informal discussions, the water cooler moments we were talking about earlier in the chapter? Well, that's all going to be lost in the virtual organisation. And therefore you run the risk that this sort of camaraderie, this support that will help the business to be more effective, doesn't actually materialise. Section 6, Privacy and Security. To set the scene, we're going to have a think about lecture example 5. Why is privacy of information a key issue for companies? Well, from a syllabus perspective, we can split this down into 3 key areas. The first is a legal duty. For example, under the Data Protection Act. So companies have a legal obligation to protect, to keep secure the information that they have about somebody. Most obviously things like credit card details, bank details, that sort of thing. And if they fail to do that, they could find themselves either sued or even prosecuted for that. So that is a key issue for them. The other key issue is that this information should be a source of competitive advantage. For example, plans for new products or projects. The last thing you want is your competitor to get wind of what you're doing and beat you to market. So any information that has a competitive value needs to be kept secure. And finally, we need to consider external effects and the impact on the market. I'm thinking here about share prices. Now, you may be aware that if you are a listed company listed on the stock exchange, you have to be incredibly careful about what information you publish. The general rule is all of your shareholders, the market as a whole, must be given that information at one point. The last thing you want is people to get wind of this information early and try and beat the market. That's effectively insider trading. It's illegal and you can be prosecuted for it. So we need to make sure that if there is something going on within the organisation, that that information is kept confidential until such time as it's launched and given to the market in a professional context. Section 6.1 recognises that as soon as an organisation connects to the internet, to the World Wide Web, they are by definition accessible worldwide. As a result, they are vulnerable from 4 perspectives. They are vulnerable to hackers and eavesdroppers. A famous example of this is a gentleman by the name of Gary McKinnon. Now, Gary McKinnon is a 28-year-old from Leicester who hacked into the FBI website in the mistaken belief that they were hiding UFO activity. Now, Gary McKinnon has Asperger's syndrome. He has no links to any form of terrorist or illegal organisation. There was no attempt to use any information that he'd accessed for any purpose other than a misguided belief that the US government was hiding evidence of extraterrestrial life forms. However, the US government was so panicked at the idea of somebody hacking into some of their most sensitive data that they really want to throw the book at him. They're in the middle of extradition talks to try and get him extradited to the United States, where he could be facing 60 years in prison. So dealt with incredibly seriously as a deterrent there. Viruses. A virus is a virus on a computer is exactly the same as a virus for a human. It is something that will infect you and cause you damage. Hoaxes. The idea that people might use information or manipulate information as a hoax. There's all sorts of famous examples. I'm sure you'll have received emails from Ethiopian bankers at some stage saying that they've got $25 million to give to you, and if you just give them your bank details, they'll deposit that $25 million in your account. An obvious hoax there, and potentially quite risky. That's an extreme example, but very risky if your information falls into the wrong hands. And finally, the denial of service attacks. We're looking here at the situation where a website can be deliberately brought down. In 2007, Estonia was the subject of a denial of service attacks. A lot of Estonian government websites were brought down. The allegation was that it was the Russians bringing it down as a result of a sort of breakdown in diplomatic relations between the two, but potentially very serious impact for these organisations. So those are some of the problems that we face. We can manage these problems using 2 types of control: application or general. Now, an application control, application specific to the software. So, for example, if you have an accounting system at work, when you double-click on the icon to launch that, you might have to put in a password. That is a classic application control. It's unique to that program. A general control is broader than that, and it's designed not to protect a specific program, but rather the general environment. So, for example, you could look at personnel controls. Have we got good, reliable people? Have we taken up their references? Are they trustworthy? Can we restrict access through the use of passwords, or even, as it talks about here, physical access through equipment? So, is there a lock on the door? Is there a password to, open the door? Keypads, all of those sorts of things are classic general controls. And finally, if the worst thing does happen and there is a breach of privacy or breach of security, is there a contingency plan in place? That will help to minimize the disruption that this causes. So, to summarize Chapter 3, we've talked about information itself, and we've used this accurate mnemonic that will be very useful for this sort of question in the exam, so that you can demonstrate you really understand what information needs to be. We then looked at information systems themselves, and we came up with a range of different systems for a range of different levels within the organisation, and we developed that slightly onto information technology for CAD and CAM. Remember the car industry here, design and manufacturing. We then sort of looked at emerging trends, and remember emerging trends, long-term trends. We talked about enterprise-wide systems, these networks that were being set up. We talked about using knowledge management systems for professionals to be able to access technical data. And we talked about customer relationship management, for example, through Amazon's bespoke recommendations. We then looked at the virtual organisation, had a quick think about what enables that to happen, advantages and disadvantages, and finally considered some of the privacy and security issues of sharing this information with across a network and potentially across the internet.